My name's Andy, and today we'll be talking about the 2006 fantasy novel, The Final Empire. For me, it's been quite some time since I've delved into the world of fantasy novels and books and stories. When I was growing up and very young, before high school, I devoured a lot of this genre and was very much a big fan of it. Mostly it was a lot of stuff from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We're talking about authors like Terry Brooks and the Shannara series, Stephen R. Donaldson and the Thomas Cavanagh series, Raymond E. Feast, and the Rift War and Cycle, and all the books involved in that, as well as some stuff made more for kids. At the age that I was, like the Choose Your Own Adventure fighting fantasy novels and everything like that. And I guess as soon as I hit high school, I kind of transitioned a little bit away from that, started reading more literary based books, or stuff like magical realism, like the novels of Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Haruki Murakami. And not to say that I became a snob because to fantasy, but it just kind of left my orbit a little bit, which is a shame, because in this book in particular I really did enjoy it. And I hear from little things I've read on the internet that the author Brandon Sanderson is someone who represents an aspect of the new fantasy. Obviously, Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, other novels of that ilk kind of represent, and the ones I mentioned before, like by Terry Brooks and Raymond E. Feist, they represented a kind of like a classic old fantasy type way of writing, where this, I think, Brandon Sanderson, and obviously a lot of stuff that's come since 2006 and now in the popular fantasy reading stuff, has really is different and tackles different things. This is a book one of a trilogy, the Mistborn trilogy. And to summarize the story, obviously I don't like to describe the whole things because these are more recommendations if people haven't read it. It's basically set in a, I guess you could say, I wouldn't say a classic fantasy world, but a dystopian type of fantasy world. It's really grim. There's these like large volcanoes that are situated around, that blow up all this ash and smoke, and it kind of, there's always constant ash fall during the day, and people have to sweep it up and get it out of the way. And there's this thing called the mist at night, which scares a lot of people. Basically, for the last 1,000 years, it's been ruled by a Dark Lord type character called the Lord Ruler. The main character is a 16-year-old street urchin named Vin. She's basically been part of this thieving guild in the capital city of this empire, ruled by this scary Lord Ruler character. She has this magical ability to, which she doesn't quite know what that is and stuff, and she comes to encounter a man called Kelsier, who is a former leader of a quite wealthy thieving group, and now become a bit of a rebel, wanting to overthrow the Lord Ruler, but not done in a kind of fantasy way, and more done in like an Ocean's 11 type of way. It's like I'm putting a team together to do a heist of the Lord Ruler's supply of precious metals, and if we get hold of them, then we can probably crumble the empire. The magic system in this book, there's these people called Mistings or Mistborn. And the way magic works in this particular world is through the use of digesting metals, and some people are able to digest metals, and then depending on the kind of metal it is, like iron, steel, pewter, and copper, they get different abilities. And if you're a Mistborn, that means you can utilize all the different metals, and it's a combination of like, I don't know, a little bit similar to some aspects of Magneto from X-Men, maybe, if people know that. But it is really interesting. And there's another type of magic system where in bracelets of metal, you can store memories or store information of things, or store even strength, or store things you might need that can help you, and you draw on that. The team of people with these different magical abilities through the use of metals, and how they manage to pull together some of the heists and what they're organizing. It's quite great. It's quite intriguing. It's like no one's really going on a quest in this book. No one's leaving really the main city for that much, maybe than here and there. It's all basically just trying to organize this great heist, which Kelsier, the leader of this gang, I guess, thinks can defeat the Lord Ruler. But there's also other stuff going on as well within that, and he's got a kind of tragic backstory, which makes you realize why he's trying to bring down this empire that's lasted for 1,000 years. For my reintroduction back into reading fantasy, I really thought this book was really well put together and plotted really well. There's an element of Vin. She's a street urchin, quick on her feet, living the kind of rough and tumble life in the city. And when she gets taken in to be part of this crew of varied and wild characters, she gets to play like the role of a noble lady, as part of a way to spy on the happenings in amongst the nobles in this empire, and that is really great in terms of her learning how to pretend to be like a noble lady, and how to behave in those kind of social areas. The Scar underclass and the noble people, it's all really interesting, those class dynamics at work as well, because in terms of the magic abilities, it's mostly noble people and their offspring, or their half offspring. Noble people in the story aren't meant to breed and have children with the Scar lower class people, and stuff. And so a lot of the main characters like Vin and Kelsey are actually half castes, as they're called, or half breeds. Judging by the way the language of how the noblemen view this underclass of people that do all the work and stuff like that. So that's really great as well. It's really dystopian in that way, and I quite like that underdog story of these people that been beaten down for so hundreds of years, and that there's some still fighting and some still trying to rebel. It's steeped in a mythology that's not info dumped on you at all, and at the heading of each chapter there's these little written pieces from a logbook that the characters find later in the story, that kind of peek you into some of that mythology in a way that's really gradual and brought out, and doesn't, like something that could be said for some older fantasy novels, is that it kind of dumps a lot on you straight away. And Brandon Sanderson, he's always moving the plot along. You're never too long sitting in one place, and if you are, and it's the character's thoughts musing on something, it's always kind of exciting and interesting and revealing something. I think some people can think of fantasy and think of it as a little bit not delving into series themes that literary writing and literary novels can do, but I think that's doing it a discredit and a disservice. I mean, fantasy and science fiction books were the very reason why I started reading and started wanting to learn how to write and tell stories in the first place. And if they hadn't imparted that on me, I don't think I'd be interested in doing creative things or wanting to tell stories, or being interested in reading even, which I think is very important for people to do. And I'm really glad that they're more popular than ever, and that people are really interested and into different storytelling like this. So I do really recommend people. I mean, even if you're not into fantasy, it might if you're not into fantasy and you've never read fantasy before, it might take a few chapters to kind of get into the flow of it, because it's been a while for me. But I've ordered now the second book in the Mistborn series, and I'm really keen to see where the story goes, especially considering how book 1 ends. And I'm really curious to see the development of the Vin character. I think sometimes, for me at least, when I was reading those books from the 80s and 90s, it was really rare to find strong lead female characters in these kind of fantasy adventure type books. So I'm really interested to see what her story arc is and how her character progresses. And I just it was quite nice, because it bring back a lot of memories to me about why, as I mentioned, why I enjoy reading in the first place. A good story well told, whether it's fantasy, modern, in a historic or whatever, is still a story well told that can be captivating and can be engaging, and everything that involves. And I think Brandon Sanderson is really great at doing that. And I think I initially discovered him before I even read him. I think I followed his YouTube series where he talks about, he goes through like a series of writing classes that he does at a university that someone kind of filmed. He's got great advice for would-be writers, and people that want to learn how to tell stories, and everything like that, regardless of if you're into fantasy or not. It's just good storytelling tips and good storytelling stuff. So I think if anyone has any recommendations for the newer fantasy novels, especially the ones I'm curious about that involve people delving into their cultural backgrounds and making like African fantasy novels or Chinese fantasy novels or what, etc. I'm curious to read that and to see what people can do with the genre that's beyond the kind of typical Western medieval frame that I think a lot of the early stuff that I read was based around, like, kings and queens, but in the kind of, knights and shining armor and sorcerers and wizards and stuff like that. I think it's really moved beyond into something else, and I'm really curious to see where a lot of these new writers have taken the genre and where it's going with that. I think it takes a lot of effort to write epic giant books like this, and it seems like he's done quite a few, and they get longer with each book in a series. But I'm curious to see where this story goes, and I couldn't recommend it more, especially for those that want to try something different, get into fantasy, and see where it can take you, and hopefully enjoy the ride and get into the story. But until next time, thanks for listening, and take care.